Good morning, Mr. Hardie. Would you take the oath?
Yes,
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Graham.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
You are Keith Hardie.
Yes,
What age are you, Mr. Hardie?
I'm 60.
And as I understand it, when you retired as a detective chief inspector. Is
That's
that correct?
yes.
And you had been in the police service for 28 years
Yes, that's right.
when you retired?
No, at the time of the incident,
Oh, at the time of the
Yeah.
incident. Sorry, how many years service did you have when you retired?
31.
Thank you. And you were attached to the Specialist Crime Division in the East Major Investigation Team
Yes, that's correct, yeah.
and based in Leith in Edinburgh.
Yes.
And explain, what area did your team cover?
Initially, I was Lothian Borders Police, so we covered the Lothian borders, but obviously in 2013 we became Police Scotland. So I had responsibility for the east of Scotland, although I was deployed throughout Scotland in my role as Senior Investigating Officer.
We've heard from other witnesses that the MIT, as they refer to your team, can be all over Scotland and deployed in different areas. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
And you say you were SIO.
Yes.
Is there only one team, or are there different teams within the major investigation?
No, there are a number of officers who form inquiry teams as and when a homicide, which is primarily what we dealt with. So when a homicide reported, we would bring together a team from our resources, all within the major inquiry team.
So any homicide, any murder, culpable homicide in Scotland could involve members of the major investigation team?
It would involve, yes.
Definitely would
Yes,
involve.
100%.
And how quickly were members of the team brought in to deal with unexplained deaths?
As soon, basically the initial response would be the divisional, the uniform, the CID. The minute there was enough evidence to suggest it was a homicide or it was, suspicious, if you like, then there would be an approach to the major investigation team to come and oversee it, I suppose, and potentially take it on.
Tell us, in your work with MIT, how many unexplained deaths or suspicious deaths were you dealing with?
At one time,
In general, how often would you be called into action?
I think we were always in action. You know, once you're deployed to a murder inquiry, for example, you can be there for a number of months, even longer, you know, if it's not easily resolved. So the team would always be in action somewhere, but we would always have the capacity to put a team together to attend a newly reported homicide or suspicious death.
And can you give us an indication of how many deaths in a year would you be dealing with?
It varies, probably somewhere in the region of 12, maybe more than that, you know, depending on, you know, as they're reported. We would sometimes go into or take on an investigation and establish there were no suspicious circumstances, in which case it would be sort of passed back to the division to deal with and see to a conclusion. Our job within the major investigation team, because we were a specialist crime division, would be to take on homicides, basically. That was the core of our workload.
And so you'd be dealing with multiple deaths of every year in your work. And how many years, remind us, you worked in that team, MIT?
I think it was about 7 or 8 years I was in the major
So
investigation.
for that whole period of time, that was your daily work?
That was my core role, yeah.
And you were the senior investigating officer in MIT?
Yes.
And we've heard other evidence about the role of a SIO.
Yeah.
So I noticed I'll come on to your statements in a moment, but I noticed in your statement that you'd said you were SIO that day And we've heard evidence that Colin Robson was a duty on-call SIO for 5 Division. We've heard evidence that Pat Campbell was the detective superintendent, was
Sure.
appointed SIO. You weren't SIO for the Shekubayo incident, were you?
No. It was a Sunday. I wasn't on call on the Sunday. We have obviously an on-call process where somebody is available to come out and deal with anything that's just been reported. I wasn't on call that weekend, but I was contacted by Detective Chief Superintendent Leslie Bowl, who asked me to attend Kirkcaldy to assist in the investigation of a death after police contact, obviously Shekubayo.
Well, we'll come on to that in more detail. But I just wanted to be clear, because we appeared on paper to have 3 SIOs, and we've heard that there's only 1 allowed,
Yeah,
really.
I was never appointed SIO for this investigation.
But that is your normal work,
Yes.
or was your normal work
Yes.
with MIT at the time. Thank you so much. Could I explain, first of all, there's a blue folder in front of you, you've opened. That contains hard copies of your statements.
Sure.
And please feel free to refer to them at any time if you wish. If there's something you'd like me to draw attention to, we can bring a section up on the screen.
Okay.
But when I maybe ask you questions about your inquiry statement, if I need you to explain something in a little more detail, it'll come up on the TV screen in front of you.
Yeah.
But you can use that blue folder throughout.
Okay, thank you.
Can we look first of all at a witness statement, PS 00667. I think this is a self-penned statement.
Yeah.
So others have called them operational statements. And this is from yourself, Detective Chief Inspector Keith Hardie. And it was, the address given is Leith Police Station in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And then if we can just move down that page, please. And we see it's 27th May 2015.
Yeah.
And it was at 8 in the morning by yourself.
Yeah.
And so this is effectively your equivalent of an operational statement.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And I think in your inquiry statement, which I'll come on to in a moment, you said that you provided this particular statement that's on the screen to PIRC.
Yeah.
And you provided a true and accurate account to the best of your recollection at the time. And you say the statement you have here would be the most accurate because it was provided at the time as opposed to 7 years later, which is when you've provided your inquiry
Sure,
statement. And you say, because my involvement was limited, I do have a good recollection of what was involved in relation to what happened, and we will come on to that. So I will ask you further questions today about it. But I think from what you said in your inquiry statement, this statement of 27th May was prepared closest to the time.
Yes.
And if there's any difference, should the chair prefer this version?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very helpful. And can we look at your inquiry statement now, please? SBPI 00230. And you'll see on the screen, this is the inquiry statement taken by the inquiry on the 2nd of November last year. And this is your inquiry statement. And if we can look, it's 25 pages, I think. If we can look at the final page, please. And we see there, it's redacted on the screen, but on your copy it may not be. And you've actually signed it on every single page. And that was on the 12th of January this year.
Yeah.
And you'll see the final paragraph 104 there says, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website.
Yes.
And you understood that when you signed it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. I've asked you a little about your experience, and you explained in this statement that you had quite limited involvement with the events leading to Mr. Bio's death.
Yeah.
And could you explain to the chair how long you were involved in the investigation regarding Mr. Bio's death?
A matter of days. Around about the time of my call out to Kirkcaldy, I became aware that the PIRC were coming out, or I can't recall whether they were actually there before me, but my understanding was that the PIRC were coming on to take primacy in the investigation. So my role at the time was basically to take an overview of that handover, if you like, of the investigation from Police Scotland to the PIRC, and to facilitate any requests on behalf of the PIRC. So other than my involvement in the inquiry was a matter of days, and after I suppose attempted to interview the police officers, that is basically where my involvement ended, because, you know, I suppose the terms of reference agreement were set up by that time and there was no requirement for me at Kirkcaldy. I still obviously had my core job back at Leith Police Station. So a matter of days after, I don't recall the dates that, you know, I spoke to the police officers involved in an attempt to get a statement from them. My recollection is I had no more involvement in the investigation whatsoever.
Right, we'll come on to that. So we've heard about the roles of Colin Robson and Pat Campbell.
Yeah.
And we've heard about the gold-silver,
Yeah.
the command structure that was put in place and headed by ACC Nicholson
Yeah.
and others who were involved. You've mentioned Leslie Bowles,
Yes.
who contacted you that morning. Can you explain to the chair what your role was? Did it have a special name? Was it simply that you were to, as you say, facilitate requests from PIRC?
It didn't have a special name. I wasn't called out for any particular role. I've known Leslie all my service. I knew Leslie was on call that weekend. She contacted me, and obviously it was a major incident we were dealing with here, a significant incident, and she asked if I could come out and assist with that. You know, it was in its very early stages at the time, and obviously as these inquiries involve, there can be specific parts of the inquiry that take precedence over others. So I suppose my role at the time was to come out, oversee a handover to the police and the PIRC, basically, and to assist the PIRC with any requests that they made to Police Scotland. This was the first incident, certainly I was involved with, where the PIRC came out and took precedence in inquiry. So it was kind of groundbreaking, if you like. So, you know, there was a process in place, but this was a first, in my experience. And I think, I'm not exactly sure, but the PIRC were fairly much in their infancy as an organisation at the time, and it was certainly the first time I was involved in an inquiry where they came out and took over.
So it was the first time you'd been involved in an inquiry where PIRC took over an
Yes.
unexplained death?
Yes.
We've heard others say it was the first time
Sure.
that they'd been involved. So when you were contacted and got involved, do you remember what time that was?
I don't, but my initial statement says 3 o'clock, and I accept that. My belief was it was perhaps a bit earlier than that, but if that's what I've noted in my statement at the time, that will be accurate, yeah.
And what resources did you bring with you? You're an SIO at MIT. You've been contacted to get involved. It's the first time PIRC have been involved. There's an unexplained death. What did you bring with you to Kirkcaldy?
Nothing, just me.
Just you?
Yeah. Obviously, Leslie Bowles being on the ground and being on call at that weekend, it would be her responsibility to bring the resources together to assist in this investigation, and one of the people she contacted was me, so I never called out a team. This was a unique event in my police service, if you like. I wasn't on call for a start, and it was basically, I was asked by one of my senior officers to come out and assist in an investigation, and once I'd been given the briefing from Leslie Bowles, I understood the significance of it, so attended there to assist as requested by her.
Tell us about the briefing that you got from Leslie Bowles.
To the best of my memory, the briefing I got on the phone from Leslie was there'd been a call in the early morning in relation to a male in possession of a knife. The police had attended, the male had been apprehended and had since died after police contact. That was the brief summary of what... So when I left to attend Kirkcaldy, in my mind, that's what I was going out to assist, to deal with.
Did you have any sort of beliefs about the nature of the situation, or was that simply the information you'd been given?
No beliefs whatsoever. No, I mean, I based what I was going out to on the very short telephone conversation I had with Leslie, because I think at that time, you know, as I said, I wasn't on call, so I wanted to get home, get changed and get there as soon as possible, get on the ground as soon as possible to assist in any way that I could. And obviously once you get there, you get a better idea of what you're doing. I mean, I'd never attended Kirkcaldy Police Station before, you know, I didn't have access to Kirkcaldy Police Station. And I'm just saying that because to explain how groundbreaking this was. I knew nobody in Kirkcaldy Police Station because obviously it used to be Fife, and we had limited, no dealings with Fife.
Had you ever had any contact with Kirkcaldy Police Office or Fife, really, in general?
Minimal. I might have. I mean, years and years ago, I worked on an internal inquiry, and I do recall visiting Fife to interview police officers, but not really. No, I mean it was all new to me. As I said, when I turned up at the station, I had no way of accessing the station because it was groundbreaking.
So you didn't really know anyone there, or
No.
have any prior relationship with anyone
Not
there?
at all. Absolutely.
And you wouldn't have known any of the officers who'd attended at Hayfield Road or any of that?
No.
Can I ask you to look at paragraph 28 of your inquiry statement? So you're obviously there to facilitate requests from PIRC. I'm interested in what contact you had with PIRC. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. Again, based on my recollection, there was a gold group meeting which Mr. Nicholson chaired at that.
We've heard there was one at 11:30, and we've heard that you weren't at that
No,
meeting.
no.
Is that the meeting you're referring to?
No, there would have been one later on. I was certainly at one gold group meeting which Mr. Nicholson chaired, and it certainly wasn't the one at 11:30 because I wasn't in attendance at Kirkcaldy at the time. So there was a meeting that Mr. Nicholson chaired. I couldn't tell you the time, but I was present at that meeting.
We've heard that you were present at a gold group meeting at 14:40 hours in the afternoon.
Possibly. Therefore, the timing of the contact with Leslie Bowell is clearly wrong if I did attend. I mean, I always thought I was out earlier than that time, to be honest with you, and I can't explain the discrepancy in my statement. But
So I think your recollection is it was earlier that you
Yes,
were contacted,
yeah,
and
yeah.
earlier you attended. And if we've heard, and the minutes show that you attended a meeting at 14:40 at Kirkcaldy, then that would seem to support your recollection rather than the time in your statement.
absolutely, clearly, I can't explain why it's wrong. I remember when I read my statement, I thought it was earlier than that, but yes, if the minutes show I was at that meeting, and I was at a meeting that was chaired by Rory Nicholson, because that was my first meeting with the officers from PIRC.
How long did you arrive at Kirkcaldy prior to that meeting? Do you remember now?
Not long. I would be guessing, but an hour or so before it, perhaps.
Right. And to go back to my question, I'd said you have explained you were there to facilitate the requests from PIRC.
Yeah.
And I'd asked you to tell us about the contact, the
Yeah.
relationship you had with PIRC that day.
So the first meeting I had with the officers, I don't know if that's the right term for them, but the individuals who came out from the PIRC was at that gold group meeting with Mr. Nicholson, when I remember the sort of senior officer from PIRC was present. I thereafter spoke with him and a colleague to establish what they required of us, because by that time I was aware that they were taking primacy in relation to it. And I don't remember much about the meeting. I'm being totally honest here. I noticed there I said the relationship wasn't very good. I think it wasn't bad, but it was very much standoffish. This was, as I say, groundbreaking that somebody was coming to take charge. I had no issues with them taking charge, but I think it was groundbreaking for them. Now, the majority of the PIRC were previous detectives, retired detectives from the West Glasgow, if you like. That was my recollection of the individuals I met at the time. Not all, but there was a number of them who were retired police officers. So I suppose the best way to describe it is maybe a wee bit standoffish, you know, because we weren't entirely, I don't think either of us were comfortable about this new groundbreaking process whereby we took a step back and acted as agents for them, if you like. No issues with it. We did, you know, if there was a request came in to me, we want this done, that done, or whatever, I would do it without any, you know, I mean, at the end of the day, it was the Procurator Fiscal's decision that the PIRC should come out, so I never had an issue with it. It was just something I wasn't used to.
And we've heard evidence that the investigators, I think they're often called, from PIRC that were at that 240 meeting, the 1440, were Keith Hardie and John Ferguson. Do you remember those names?
No, I don't remember the names.
And you've mentioned their position. They were the majority were retired police officers.
That was it. I think they were, but it was an impression I got anyway, and I think that was, you know, something I might have been aware of prior to my attendance that day, that you know, there was a lot of retired detectives from Glasgow, the west of Scotland, who had since joined the PIRC. And I did know a couple of them, you know, from my police career.
And what impact, just from your impression of a number of people being former or retired police officers from a particular area,
Yeah.
Glasgow in the west, what impact did that have on you and your role? Because you obviously were working in the east. What was your impression?
No issue with it. Obviously, because, you know, in my mind they were previous detectives. In my mind they were experienced at doing what they were about to do, right, because they were experienced investigators.
Did you have any knowledge or awareness at that time of what their rank had been in Glasgow or the West when they were officers?
A couple of them, yeah, but generally speaking, no. My memory is, I think there was a retired detective chief super, although I don't think he was called out. I think he was the head of the PIRC, who I knew from previous my time in the police. But I would say probably my recollection was there were senior officers prior to retiring and joining the PIRC.
And you said the majority from Glasgow or the West. Do you remember where the others came from?
I remember speaking to a fairly young guy who had no police experience whatsoever. But again, I don't recall specifics, but I think it was at the post-mortem, which I attended at a later time. I ended up meeting this guy who wasn't a retired police officer, but was a member of PIRC.
We heard some evidence. Well, before I mention that, do you remember how many people from PIRC were in Kirkcaldy on the afternoon of the 3rd of May?
To be honest with you, I would be guessing. I think I would be guessing. I knew there was one. I don't know if it was Keith Hardie or whoever was present at the Gold Group meeting, but I suppose they would have been called out as well and perhaps arrive not all at the same time. But I couldn't tell you. I would be guessing at 4 or thereabouts, something like that.
We've heard evidence from Pat Campbell that he thought there were about 4 or 5.
Yeah.
Is that? Yeah. When you arrived at Kirkcaldy, were you introduced to the people who were there from PIRC?
No. I don't think they were there when I got there. I don't know, but no, there was no introduction because, no, I wasn't introduced. It was the meeting with Mr. Nicholson chaired that I became aware of who they were. because they were in attendance. And I think there would only have been one, because obviously a gold group meeting, it's not everybody that's involved in the case. It's, I suppose, your senior individuals from the different disciplines who sit round the table for the meeting.
Right. We have heard evidence that Keith Hardie was from PIRC, and the minutes show he was from PIRC. And we've heard the name John Ferguson was also there.
Okay.
We've heard him in connection with PIRC.
Yeah.
Do you remember if there was 2 people associated with PIRC, or?
I honestly can't remember.
So you've talked about this 1440 meeting, and before that meeting, did you have a briefing from anyone?
I probably had a discussion with Leslie Bowell.
She was at Kirkcaldy when you arrived?
Yes, she was, yeah.
Right. And tell us about that discussion.
This is, I must stress, this is from memory only.
Of course, yes.
My recollection of the briefing I had from Leslie Bowell was that the police had got called to a male in the street in possession of a knife. When the police attended, he went for or ran towards the female police officer in possession of a knife. She ran away and he tripped her, which caused her to fall to the ground, at which point the other officers arrived and, I don't know if this is the correct word, but descended on the individual who had gone towards the female police officer. That is 100% what I was told at the time.
Thank you. And I think you were asked about this in your inquiry statement.
Yeah.
So let's look at paragraph 34, and there's another one as well, 55, we'll come on to in a moment. Let's look at 34 first of all. And it says, from my recollection only, when I got to Kirkcaldy, I established, now I can't be sure where I established this, but I established that the male had been walking along the road in possession of a knife. He'd been stabbing the knife at parked cars, is my recollection. The police were called. They attended and they attempted to apprehend him. One of the police officers was approached by the male and she turned and ran off, at which point she clipped her legs and she fell to the ground. At this point, he was still in possession of the knife, and the other officers who had attended the scene overpowered him, and they were in fear of their colleagues' safety. So that's paragraph 34. I'll look straight away at paragraph 55 because you give some further information, and then I'll ask you some questions about it. I had this clear picture in my mind of I met the female who was assaulted, a very, very petite individual, running away, being tripped by the legs of the male, and the other officers reacting to that because the male was in possession of a knife. So can I say, I'm not saying 100% that's what's happened. I wasn't there, but that was the picture that I had in my mind and still do have because of what I was told the day, that day. So can we go back to 34 first of all, just to get you to clarify 1 or 2 points, please. So as I understand it, this is the briefing you received prior to going into the Gold Group meeting.
Yes.
At 1440.
Yeah.
And it says here, the male had been walking along the road in possession of a knife, stabbing the knife at parked cars. The police were called and attended and attempted to apprehend him. And then you mention the female officer. You see she was approached by the male and she turned and ran off. Was that, as far as you recall, the first thing that happened? She approached the male and then, the female officer was approached by the male and turned and ran off.
Yes.
And then you say clipped her legs and fell to the ground. Now in paragraph 55, you then talked about being tripped by the legs of the male.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could just explain a little bit more to the chair.
Sure.
What your recollection is of that briefing.
The best way I could describe it, and as it was told to me, was a tap tackle, like the male using his leg to, as the female's running away, to trip the individual, so to knock one leg behind the other to cause her to fall over. That's how it was described to me. Not in so much detail, but, you know, when I say tripped or clipped, that's what I was referring to.
So that's how you understood
Yes.
the description.
Yes.
Do you remember exactly what Bowles said to you in relation to that aspect? We've heard Leslie Bowles wasn't at the scene, so I'm
No.
quite interested in what she shared with you.
Just exactly as it's said there. You know, the picture in my mind, and it's a picture I developed after the information I got from Leslie Bowles. I wasn't there, but the picture that developed in my mind was the police attending because this guy was in possession of a knife. The police approaching the individual running towards the female who ran away. He tripped her, causing her to fall, and at around that time, other officers apprehended him, descended on him. If I know that's perhaps not the right terminology. But.
Thank you. And then you say in paragraph 34, at this point he was still in possession of the knife, and then the other officers overpowered him in fear of their colleagues' safety. And I think you say that again in paragraph 55, because the male was in possession of a knife.
Yeah.
Was it your understanding from the briefing from Leslie Bowles that the man at the scene remained in possession of a knife?
Absolutely, that was my understanding from the briefing. But, you know, this, the information was sketchy at the time, but nonetheless, I'm not saying that's what happened. That's what I was told had happened
Yes.
when I attended at Kirkcaldy.
Thank you. And what impact did that have on you and the role that you played that day in the events? What difference did that make to you?
Nothing, because at the end of the day, as I say, I worked with Leslie all my service. Huge respect for her. The fact that she'd asked me to come out, I knew obviously the circumstances dictate. This is a major incident. You know, this is a, however you want to call it, death after police contact, death in police custody, but a serious incident, a serious and tragic incident. So, and how did it happen, I suppose, would be my job as an investigator to find out how it happened if I had been appointed the SIO in the role. And what I got from Leslie was it had to be what she was told. So you're talking about third or fourth hand information, but as far as I'm concerned, for my statement, that was the information I was given at the time. And, you know, nothing I did during my time at Kirkcaldy, you know, nobody came to me and said, oh, apparently this isn't what happened. You know, there was nothing, no information that I got in my role that would suggest anything different to me other than what I was told initially.
And was it any part of your role to be involved in or to consider different hypotheses about what happened, or to identify priority actions or lines of investigation?
It would have been, but the difference was the PIRC were taking it over, so therefore that was no longer my role. If I'd been appointed the SIO, I would absolutely have been looking at scene protection, if you like, looking at major lines of inquiry. They talk about the golden 24 hours when something's reported, and the first 24 hours are massively significant because, you know, that's your sort of best chance to secure any available evidence. So I would be looking at house-to-house investigations as a priority, to get out there and try and identify anybody who may have witnessed some or all of this incident. But it wasn't my role at the time because the PIRC were.
Did anyone ask you to help with that type of thing, given your experience?
No.
Uh,
I don't recall anybody asking me to help.
I'm interested, you've said the golden hours are the first 24.
Yeah.
Is that a normal sort of?
It's a sort of recognised terminology when you're dealing with an incident, that your first 24 hours are the golden hours, or they talk about the first hour, but your first 24 hours are where your best opportunities are to gather evidence that may be of significance to investigate what you're dealing with.
Thank you. I ask you, when you've said that you went into the 1440 hours Gold Group meeting and you met at least one person from PIRC?
Yeah.
We've heard that was Keith Hardie
Yeah.
at that meeting. Did you have a clear understanding at that time what the remit of PIRC was? You've talked about them taking primacy, I think was the word you used, over the investigation. But did you have a good understanding of what aspects of the investigation they were taking over or not?
Yeah, my understanding was they were taking over everything. Every line of investigation, they were taking over the inquiry, but we were to assist them as agents to them, if you like. So if Keith Hardie had come to me and said, I want this, this and this done, we would obviously have access to far more resources than they do. I would then get officers, or we would arrange to raise the action and get officers from Police Scotland to carry out these actions. However, I can remember, for example, I think house-to-house investigations, the PIRC said they wanted to do that themselves, which is absolutely fine, you know. As far as I was concerned, you're in charge, you tell me what you want done and I'll facilitate it for you. That's what became my role on the Sunday and thereafter.
So we've heard that, well, you use the word we have access to resources.
Yeah.
And I'm interested, you've said that you arrived yourself with your experience on the 3rd. And when you talk about access to resources, what did that mean for you?
Well, for example, if you take the PIRC out of it, and it's a normal, you know, a homicide inquiry, your gold commander in the gold group process, I as SIO would go to the gold commander and say, I want a team of 12 uniformed officers and a house-to-house coordinator to be appointed by you and to be with me as soon as possible so we can carry out house-to-house inquiry.
So if you were being brought in as SIO and you wanted a team to work with you on an unexplained death, how many officers would you, or members of the police, would you be looking for to help you with that?
It would depend. I mean, it would depend on the nature of the investigation, if you like. We had specialist roles, you know, so me as an SIO, I would always have a deputy, I would always have a crime scene manager who, you know, as the title dictates, would manage the crime scene. We would have family liaison officers who would liaise with the family of the victim, all specially trained in their own discipline. We would have a house-to-house coordinator who would coordinate the house-to-house, a CCTV coordinator. His job would, or his or her job would be to go and review the area in question to identify any potential opportunities of CCTV. So these would all be appointed by me immediately if I was the SIO. And then after that you'd have your inquiry teams who would basically go out and interview witnesses and carry out any other investigations in relation to the crime itself. So typically you would have all these experts, family liaison officers, the ones I've referred to.
Yes.
I would have a deputy to act for me in my absence as the inquiry progressed. And then inquiry teams, you might have 6 or 7 inquiry teams which are reduced later on, dependent on how the inquiry goes, you know. If it's solved fairly quickly, then you would be talking about a reduction in your inquiry teams because there's less to do and there's demands elsewhere. I've managed inquiries when I've had maybe 25 to 30 inquiry officers carrying out various inquiries, but you would always have your core of experts there when you realise what you were dealing with.
So at the sort of head of that investigation team, you'd have yourself as SIO, a deputy SIO, a crime scene manager, family liaison officer, house-to-house coordinator, CCTV coordinator.
Yes.
You would have maybe 6 or 7 inquiry teams. How many would be in the inquiry team?
Two.
2 in each
Yeah,
team.
yeah.
And they would be doing different parts of the inquiry, taking witness statements, doing other investigations,
Yes.
and that type of thing. And you could have maybe 25 to 30 people in
On a
total.
larger inquiry, basically the way the police operated, and rightly so, is the minute you solved it, if you like, you got the person in custody, then I would review it as SIO to say, do I need this amount of resources because we're now satisfied we've got the person responsible.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of work to do after that point, but it would normally result in maybe 2 inquiry teams staying with the inquiry till the end, if you like, and the rest would be able to be deployed elsewhere.
And if there were 5 separate loci, would that increase the size of that team, or would that be accommodated within what you've described?
When you say loci, 5 loci, what do you mean by that?
Well, let me explain the circumstances that we have heard evidence about here. So there was the Hayfield Road where Mr. Bile was restrained. But in addition, there was the hospital that he was taken to where he ultimately passed away. There was his partner's address and his address, relatively near to the Hayfield Road area, and that she had made a call in the morning saying he wasn't there and there had been signs of a disturbance. And that house was seized. There was the property of his friends who he'd been to in the early hours prior to going to Hayfield Road. And there was we've heard some evidence about an incident with a friend which had occurred at roughly between 6:30 and 7 o'clock in the morning, where there was evidence available. We've heard from Pat Campbell that the friend had removed his clothing and put it in a laundry basket in the bathroom of his family home, and that was another area where the police attended. So that's the 5, as I understand it. So the actual incident itself at Hayfield Road was one location, but there were other locations identified where work needed to be done by the investigative team.
Without a doubt, yeah.
So that's what I mean when I say 5. So in terms of the investigative team, if you'd been an SIO in that situation, would that have expanded the team numbers, or would you have been able to accommodate it within the numbers you've described?
Based on my experience, I totally get, there's 4 addresses, places of interest to us, right? If I had been the SIO in that investigation, my take on it would have been Sheik O'Bale was walking along the road unharmed, right? After police contact, he's dead. So your number 1 priority has to be around the scene of where he was apprehended. The 4 other scenes I would describe as secondary scenes where I accept you might get witness evidence as to, for example, what Sheko had been doing or how he'd been acting, etc., etc. But because we had evidence of Sheko being fit and well, not injured, walking along the road, then the number 1 scene where I would be looking to put all my resources would be Hayfield Road, where he was apprehended by the police. Albeit the other 4 scenes you described to me would be relevant as the inquiry progressed. The problem with scenes is you have to have officers to protect the scenes, and it becomes really resource intensive if you've got 5 scenes protected by police officers. You run out, basically. So you need to do a quick assessment of why are we protecting that particular scene? Are we likely to have any forensic evidence, because you're protecting it, I suppose, forensically, to allow the forensic team to come in and seize any forensic evidence, if you like. But based on the circumstances, and I'm only saying this if I was the SAO, that's how I would have dealt with the situation I find myself.
So, in your experience as SRO, you would have classed those as secondary
Yes.
scenes. And as a secondary scene, does that need to be generally forensically protected or secure in some way?
Not always, but you know, and we always say you're far better scaling something up when it's reported to you, because it's easy to scale it down. It's not so easy to scale it up if you've scaled it down in the first place. So I totally get, you know, the need for that, but I think it would be important that we, as quickly as possibly, established, you know, how relevant these scenes were to the investigation. Now, my take on it would have been, at the time, depending on your available resources, my number one scene, without any shadow of a doubt, is Hayfield Road, where Sheko was apprehended, arrested by the police, because prior to that, there was no evidence that any harm had befallen him whatsoever. So you're not talking about somebody who's been the victim of a serious assault who ultimately died of his injuries after being apprehended by the police, if you get what I'm saying there. I know that's hypothetical, but you know, that's... So, in my mind, in the circumstances of Sheko Bail, we were dealing with a male who was not injured in any way until he encountered the police. When he walked along that road, to all intents and purposes, and there was no evidence to the contrary, he was, you know, uninjured, shall we say. Or that was the information we had at the time.
So, in relation to those secondary locations, what sort of resources would you have placed in relation to those?
I suppose until we knew exactly what we were dealing with, it's just about scene protection if it is a scene, you know, if it is a crime scene. So, again, my memory is that we had to take some people out of houses that Sheko had been in to protect that scene. And that's something that's just come to me now, actually, that I'm thinking about it. So, you know, it might well have been, as the inquiry moved on, we got evidence that there was a fight in the house or something like that, and then that house would become significant. I'm not saying that happened, absolutely, but these are the things you have to consider. So, you would be talking about 2 officers at every scene to protect the scene, but you don't really know what you're protecting until the inquiry evolves. If you got information that there was something significant had happened in the house, then you would want a full forensic team in that house for any evidence of assault, blood spill, or anything like that.
Right. And in terms of the investigative team size, would you need additional officers to protect secondary scenes? Or would it be accommodated within the numbers that you described 5 minutes ago?
It would be 2 uniformed officers at every scene, and their job would basically be to prevent anybody, or depending what I'm talking about, a house, for example. You would have officer at the front and the back protecting that house to make sure anything evidential cannot be changed or disturbed until we satisfy ourselves that there's actually no relevance to that scene, and it's not a scene, if you like.
And in terms of, you know, you've talked about determining the relevance and how quickly you can maybe stand those officers down. How long, what sort of information would you need before you could stand those 2 uniformed officers down?
Well, you know, if Sheko, and again this is hypothetical, if Sheko was in a house with 2 other individuals, the individuals had been interviewed and said there was no problem, he left the house here, he was fine at the time, then in my opinion, that's time to stand that down. It's not a scene, it's not a potential scene anymore. We've got 2 witnesses speaking about Sheko's actions prior to the contact with the police, but nothing else there that's going to assist the progression of the investigation.
When you use the expression, when he left, he was fine at the time, what are you...
That's
what do you mean?
Hypothetical. I'm
Right.
just saying, you know, if we found out from the witnesses who were in his company that there was no incident of note in the house or whatever, and that he left at a particular time, then that scene becomes irrelevant to the inquiry. Therefore, you'd be in a position to stand the officers down and say there's no longer a need to protect that as a potential crime scene.
If there was evidence that, or no evidence to suggest he was not physically fine, but there was evidence to suggest he felt disrespected and left the property, is that something that would cause you to continue to preserve that scene, or are you...
Well, if you're saying to me he felt disrespected, then in my mind that would be, so there's been some sort of argument, if you like, verbal or otherwise. If that information was fed back to me, I would say let's hold on to this scene just now until we bottom this out one way or the other.
And in what way would you as SIO expect that to be bottomed out?
Witness evidence. If you're saying to me he felt disrespected, where are we getting that evidence from? Can we corroborate it? If we've got two witnesses to say that he'd been involved in an argument, I would absolutely want to keep that scene protected until we got to the bottom of, has anything happened in that house which has led to his death?
Right. And when you're talking about has anything happened, I appreciate we're talking hypothetically, but what type of thing are you thinking you would want to know about it for this anything happened?
Physical confrontation.
All right.
What was going on in the house? Was there alcohol involved? Was there drugs involved? How were people's demeanour? Were people there enjoying themselves? But you said if it felt disrespected, that would immediately be a warning word for me, if you like. Disrespected, there's been an argument there. We need to know what's happened in that house, and until we find out what has happened, we will keep it protected as a potential crime scene.
And a physical altercation, is that, what do you mean by that? Is that a fight or?
Yeah, a fight, an assault, any physical coming together,
Right.
Yeah.
And if the information available to you was that there was no physical altercation, what impact would that have on your decisions about releasing the property?
If there was no evidence of physical altercation, then somebody would have to justify to me why we're holding on to that as a scene, if you like. What can we take from that house that we are protecting that's going to assist us in finding out what happened to Sheiko? But, as I said before, in my mind, Sheiko was uninjured and, well. He was walking along the road. There was no evidence that I was aware of that he was injured in any way. So I would certainly be looking at putting all my resources towards where the police contact was and get the surrounding area, any property that has a view onto that area, like you would do with anything. We need to get into these houses to establish if anybody's seen or heard anything suspicious, or that would assist the inquiry.
Talking about these houses, I'm interested in, obviously, in your experience with MIT as SIO. You have had to consider the sort of legal authority for seizing a house in a situation where it may be a secondary location. What processes do you go through, or did you go through when you did that job, to secure the proper authority?
I know you're talking about sort of warrants here, but, well, I assume you are.
Well, we've heard that one of the options is consent and one of the options
Yes.
is a warrant.
I was just going to say that. The first thing we would do would ask the people present at the house we were interested in if they would mind moving elsewhere to allow us to protect the house until we establish what we're dealing with.
And how would you expect officers to obtain consent in 2015, for example?
Just by speaking to the people in the house, explaining, there may be something in this house that may assist us in our investigation, so would you mind coming with us? We'll make arrangements to house you elsewhere until we've carried out our investigation to prevent any disturbance of any potential evidence within the house itself.
We heard some evidence from an officer who said he would give an explanation for the reasons behind the request, explain that he was looking for their permission or their consent, that on that basis it could be withdrawn at any time, and he would note that in his notebook and get a signature if possible.
Yeah.
What would you say about that approach?
Absolutely, 100%. That would be one of the many options available to you, and certainly the easiest option. And if you've got people who are on site, and willing to assist with inquiry, I don't think they would have any issue with moving out of a property. I mean, we wouldn't obviously just say, right, you're out now, thanks very much. We would accommodate them and house them elsewhere until we were in a position to return the property to the individual.
Right. And if a situation arises where that consent is not given, or that consent is not available for some reason, you mentioned warrant. What would the procedure normally be? Would you just simply seize the house without a warrant?
Yes.
Or what would you do?
Seize the house without a warrant and then apply for a warrant to search the premises.
Right. And why would you do it that way?
Because if you don't have control over the house, then it becomes almost pointless to, control it at a later time. If you go to somebody and say, look, we would like to seize this house because it may be a potential crime scene, and they say no, then the process of getting a warrant wouldn't be something that happened in minutes. And the minute you leave that scene, you've lost control over it. So we would seize it and apply for the warrant.
And we've heard that those applications are through an on-call fiscal.
Yes.
And the police will then explain the circumstances to the fiscal, who will then, if he agrees or she agrees, go on to seek that from the sheriff.
Yeah.
And in relation to a secondary location, are the circumstances for obtaining a warrant any different?
No, I think you would have to justify why you were applying for a warrant in the first place, You would have to put some form of case together to go to the fiscals with, who would then go to sheriff to justify why you want to seize this, property, if you like. I've never found myself in a position of applying for a warrant to seize a property just in case there might be something in it, So there really has to be some sort of, even if it's circumstantial evidence, to suggest there's a good reason for getting a warrant to search that house.
And thinking about searching, we've been talking about seizing the house.
Yeah.
In terms of searching, is the authority the same process, seeking either consent or going to get a warrant?
Yeah.
And in terms of timing for a search, so assume you've seized the property, would you want to get consent in advance of a search to make sure?
Yeah.
And if you didn't have that consent, what would your position be about a warrant?
We would apply for a warrant to search.
Before searching?
Oh yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
And if you hadn't obtained consent or a warrant, would your officers just simply search a property?
Again, it would depend on the circumstances, to be honest. That becomes, I wouldn't, if I was in charge of the investigation, I wouldn't want my officers seizing items of property from a house without consent from the owner or a warrant to do that. It wouldn't happen, because then that evidence would become contentious at a later point. That would be my take faced on that if that scenario was presented to me. When I say search the house, I'm also talking about a forensic examination of the house. Our forensic team going in there to see if there's any evidence of assault or whatever.
So you'd want the warrant before you did that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or consent?
Yes.
And you said, when I asked you if you didn't have consent or a warrant, And you said, well, it depends on the circumstances. Is there another power or authority available to the police to carry out a search of a house, even if there's no consent or a warrant?
There are certain circumstances, you know, if somebody's made off from the police, you have a common law power if you're in close pursuit to enter a property and search for it. But in a situation like this, which isn't a live incident, if you like, we're well past that time. But I would certainly be of a mind of we're protecting it, we're seizing the house without a warrant or consent, but we're applying for the warrant.
Right.
Because if you don't protect the scene, it becomes potentially a pointless exercise.
We did hear some evidence that the police have the power, if they have concerns about preservation of life,
Yeah.
they could search a house in a sense of urgency, an emergency
Yeah.
situation.
Yes, absolutely.
And is that the sort of common law power you're
Yes.
referring to?
I mean, you know, if the police attend an address and there's screaming coming from the house or any concerns for the occupants, then we have a common law power to force entry to that house if we think somebody's in danger.
And I think the description was also not just preservation of life, but perhaps protecting or avoiding a situation where they're concerned that important evidence is being destroyed.
Yeah.
Would that be the same?
Absolutely. Yeah.
But assuming that situation or circumstances did not exist, then you would still seek consent or a warrant?
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I ask you about some evidence we've heard about a knife being recovered at the scene?
Yeah.
I think you were asked about this. I think in paragraph 35, actually, of your inquiry statement. You say, I learned from someone else that a knife had been recovered at the locus of the scene of the incident. And if I'm being personally honest here, the knife had been recovered already, forensically and photographed by an officer using his mobile phone. I had some reservations about that, however, no major reservations. When I saw the photographs from the phone, I thought, no, I had reservations about it. I do know why, but obviously if you were going to protect that knife in situ, it's lying on the ground and you would have 2 officers to protect it. There was a lot going on with limited resources available at the time, and they possibly thought, we can't afford to keep 2 officers here purely to protect a knife on the ground. Let's recover it forensically in one of the plastic tubes, and the officer photographed it on his mobile phone prior to recovery. I'm interested in in a situation where maybe you'd been SIO and you're looking at an incident in a particular location, what steps would you normally take in terms of recovering a knife forensically?
I would get the forensic officers, the scenes of crime officers they were called, to come out and recover that knife, photograph it in situ and recover it forensically. It's just how I would do it.
Why would you do it that way?
Because I was aware of the importance of the knife in the whole scenario. It was, you know, it was massively important.
Why do you say that in terms of the scenario of what you were aware?
Because if Sheku hadn't have been in possession of a knife or the male hadn't been in a possession of a knife, then he presents less of a threat to the officers who are attending there.
Right. And that's what makes the knife important?
In my opinion, crucial. And I kind of get why it was done and the way it was done, but to photograph it with your mobile phone and then recover it in a tube, albeit forensically, I wouldn't have had that. I wouldn't have, you know, if I had any control over that, I would have said, I want 2 cops standing by that knife and I want the scenes of crime, the experts to come out, photograph it in situ. So you're not only photographing the knife, you've got general shots that show you exactly where the knife was, you know, to put some context around about it. And then to seize it forensically so you're not potentially damaging any evidence that's contained on the knife.
And what are the benefits, you know, from an SIO perspective, of doing it forensically with a scenes of crime officer?
the scenes of crime are experts, that's their job, so there would be no possibility whatsoever that that knife was contaminated during its recovery. Officers don't have that training. I know how they would do it. They would put gloves on and they would put the knife in the plastic tube. So there's, you know, a good likelihood they're not going to contaminate it. But because of the significance of that item in this investigation, I think it would be unprofessional for it not to be done by the experts. And a photograph of a knife on a bit of grass isn't really, it doesn't tell you much. You know, you need the surrounding shots of the scene. I accept it could have been taken at a later date, but I would have insisted on the experts coming out to recover that knife and to take the photographs of it in situ and the general shots to allow you to put context on where it was going.
And would your position on that be the same, the evidence you've given be the same, if the person was not declared deceased at the scene, but has been taken away in an ambulance unconscious, not breathing? Would that change your evidence on that?
If I was dealing with something that ultimately led to somebody's death, it wouldn't change. No, it wouldn't.
Thank you. We've heard evidence that the officer who recovered the knife from the scene then travelled in the ambulance with Mr. Bio to go to hospital. And I wonder if you have any comments to make about that.
I never knew that, but it's, in my mind, it's a no-no. It's an absolute no-no.
And why do you say an absolute no-no?
Well, but, you know, what sort of inferences can be drawn from somebody being in an ambulance with the knife and the individual who was allegedly in possession of it? That's just another example of why, you know, you bring two experts, scenes of crime experts, to a scene. They take that knife away and don't, you know, they have no contact.
I don't want to give you the wrong impression.
Right.
We've heard evidence that the individual who recovered the knife went into the ambulance with
All right,
Mr.
okay.
Bio, but not with the knife. Sorry,
Yeah,
I may-
okay. Again, a potential of cross-contamination. I wouldn't like it. I wouldn't have it, you know. I would have the scenes of crime officers totally separate. I mean, contamination is massive, you know, during a criminal investigation. So, no, to me, it's not right. It's not right.
Thank you.
In my experience of dealing with major investigations, I understand these things happen. I kind of understand why they do happen, but I'm sorry, but in my opinion, that's not right.
And then we've also heard evidence about officers going to the hospital where Mr. Bio died. And the SIO understood they were standing outside a side room where his body was retained. But we may hear that they were within the room and they were not wearing forensic clothing. Now, again, I'm interested in your experience as an SIO, whether you have any comments about officers sitting in a room for, as I understand, 10 hours without forensic clothing other than gloves.
Not officers who have attended the scene, different officers who have never...
Different officers.
I've got to be honest, I wouldn't really have much of an issue with that. No, I wouldn't have an issue with that, to be honest with you. I wouldn't see the need for these officers to be protected forensically. If they'd been at the scene, yeah, absolutely. If they'd been at the scene, they should have no further contact or be at the hospital anyway. But if these are officers who have not been at the scene and are just there, you know, to carry out a role, then personally, I wouldn't have an issue with it. I wouldn't see the need for them to be forensically protected.
And would the position be the same if they were collecting the samples that had been taken or that type of thing from the medical practitioners?
Sorry, I don't...
So if the medical practitioners had taken blood samples and things, and would that cause any concern for you that those were handed to those officers?
There's a process you have to go through when you're doing that. You know, so by the time it's handed to the officers, that sample should be secured in a bag or a tube or whatever, so that there's no issue around contamination. So that process would negate the chance of contamination.
Could I ask you about a couple of the Gold Group meeting minutes? We looked at these yesterday, PS 06492. If we don't have them at the moment, I can move on. I'll move on. Do you remember at any of the Gold Group meetings or any of your discussions in Kirkcaldy that day about the issue regarding obtaining initial personal accounts or statements, detailed accounts from the officers? Do you remember anything about that?
This is something I've thought about a lot, to be honest with you, and to the best of my knowledge, when I attended Kirkcaldy, my number one priority would be to get the statements from the officers who attended the scene, because they are, never mind house to house or anything, they are 100% witnesses to what has happened. My understanding when I got there is I asked the question, you know, have we got statements from the officers? The perfect scenario for me in these circumstances would be 2 detectives to interview the police officer. Detectives are more experienced in taking statements and tend to go into more detail, so that would be the perfect scenario in my opinion. I do recall getting told that they were preparing their own operational statements.
When were you told that?
I don't know. It would have been fairly soon after I got there, because, as I said to you, you know, common sense approach would be, I want to hear what the officers who attended there are saying, basically. So,
do you remember who told you that?
I don't remember. Honestly, don't. There's another, and this is what stuck in my mind. There's a post-incident procedure called a PIP that I was trained in many years ago, and it involves when a police officer's involved in shooting somebody. Now they all get taken away, the officers involved, and they get, this was the training I was given because it was sort of questioned at the time. It might have changed, but they get 24 hours to sort of come to terms with what they've dealt with and discuss it with their colleagues before they provide their statements, which, as you can imagine, from the outside looking in, you know, that'd be like, well, why, if you like, why are they allowed to? That was, so, I'm not saying that's 100% true. That was my recollection of my training from that. And I just had in the back of my mind that these officers might be afforded that same opportunity. But I do remember being in Kirkcaldy, I remember it well, and in my, as far as I was aware, the police officers were in the station preparing their operational statements. But that never ever came to fruition, if you like. But that was my belief very shortly after arriving at Kirkcaldy, because it would be one of the first things I would want to know. I mean, you're talking about however many officers were there, 6, they are your most significant witnesses in all of this. So to seize their evidence immediately would be my number one priority if I was the SIO in the investigation.
And if I mean, have you been faced in your experience as an SIO with a situation where officers weren't prepared to provide operational statements?
Other than this investigation, no. No.
And is that in your full years of service or only up to 2015?
My full service, yeah. I worked in the counter-corruption unit for a while, and there were a couple of occasions that an officer refused to provide a statement, but there were suspects as opposed to witnesses. Right. And obviously you have a right to remain silent, but on this occasion, these officers were witnesses. That was made clear to them, and I never experienced that in any other time in my 31 years service.
Do you remember when you say it was made clear to them that they were witnesses? Do you remember how that was done?
Yeah, it was a sort of pre-arranged preamble, if you like, but I do recall attempting to take statements of the officers concerned and making it perfectly clear to them that there was a witness statement we were looking for and they weren't suspects.
And I think we'll come on to that,
Yeah.
as that, as I understand it, that wasn't on the 3rd. I'm interested in your experience as SIO. If you had been faced with this situation where your priority is to get the statements of the officers, but you haven't obtained them, what techniques or tactics or leverage would you use to obtain statements of some sort or accounts from officers who had been told that they were witnesses, not suspects?
I suppose my answer to that is I was never in that position, so I don't know what tactics I would use. I would probably just, if I'm being honest, and obviously what happened on that day was I never accepted it. I thought they were coming. That was 100% my belief. And then, you know, as the day progressed, I was no longer in charge of the investigation, so it was no longer my call, if you like.
When you say you were no longer in charge, you've talked earlier about you facilitating PIRC, who were leading the investigation. What do you mean, as the day went on, you were no longer in charge?
Because PIRC had been called out to take over the investigation, and my job was to facilitate the handover and act as their agents, if you like, to carry out any requests they made of me and my team.
Initial requests?
Yeah.
And did there come a point that day where you felt that you were no longer required to facilitate requests from PIRC?
Oh no, not at all, no. I was always, until you're talking about the early hours of the morning where everybody was like, you know, like people need to get home here and have a sleep and get back out in the morning. But no, I was always there for them to carry out any requests that they would have asked. It perhaps didn't have to come through me, but, you know, I was there, yeah.
Sorry, it's maybe me. I was trying to understand what you meant when you said you were no longer in charge of the investigation.
Well, I suppose after the Gold Group meeting, it was made clear then that the PIRC had taken ownership of the inquiry, so I was no longer... in my opinion, I was never in charge of the investigation. I was out there to, a unique set of circumstances, I was called out to assist with an ongoing investigation and to assist with a handover to the PIRC, who were taking primacy in the investigation.
Right. So just to go back to the situation with the status of the officers, were you ever part of any discussion about advising the officers about status or anything along those lines? Did you ever speak to the officers in the PIM suite or the canteen, as it was?
As per my statement, I spoke to them a couple of days later in an attempt to take the statement from...
I'm just thinking about the 3rd of May at the moment.
No, I never. I didn't know them, you know, it wasn't as I probably did pass them in the corridor or whatever, but I didn't know who they were, because, I mean, if it was Lothian and Borders, there'd be every chance I would know the individuals because I was in a different force area, albeit we were Police Scotland at the time. I didn't know them. But I certainly had in the back of my mind the officers involved in this investigation are away, being given privacy to sit down and prepare their operational statements. That's what I had in my mind. And somebody's told me that they were preparing their operational statements, but it's because I asked the question. It was in response to...
I'm very sorry to interrupt. It's just that the real time has stopped.
All right. Well, I think we can carry on. It's actually, in fact, it's nearly past. We usually have a break anyway at this point, so we'll just take the 20-minute break now.
Thank you. It's all right.
I'm sorry we were interrupted there, Mr. Hardie. The transcription is now, I understand, working again. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. You've explained to us before the break in relation to the status of the officers in the statements as you understood the position on the day. I'd like to ask you something else about the gathering of the officers who'd been at Hayfield Road, and we've heard evidence that they were gathered together in Kirkcaldy in the canteen area. And I appreciate you don't know Kirkcaldy Police Office, and we've heard some evidence about consideration being given whether to gather them all together as they were or to separate them. We've heard evidence about the PIP SOP, and I'm interested in your perspective. Obviously you've got experience as SIO. Whereas an event had taken place in a location like Hayfield Road and the officers are all from Kirkcaldy Police Office and they return there and they're gathered together in the canteen, what your views are on that decision?
I think you would have to take cognizance of the fact that these officers might be traumatised. For example, being totally professional about it, and obviously with my job being securing the best evidence possible, what I would have liked in those circumstances was 2 detectives for each of the officers to interview them immediately before they gathered together.
And why would you have taken that approach if you'd been SIO?
It's the perfect scenario. You want to interview a witness before they're influenced by other people's version of events. I mean, if you take a room of people, show them an incident, they'll give you totally different versions of what they've seen. That's just the way it is, you know, it always has been. But in a perfect scenario, I would have had 2 detectives interviewing each of the officers as soon as reasonably practical, to prevent any, I'm not saying there's collusion, absolutely not, but to prevent being influenced by other witnesses' versions of events.
So as an SIO, you would consider that approach to give you the best evidence available?
Yeah, but it's not necessarily considering the impact on the individuals who have been at the scene and the possibility of them being traumatised in any way. But that, you know, in a sort of cold light of day, that would be my preference as to how we would secure the witness testimony of these individuals who were at the scene at the time.
And if officers were traumatised, or there was a suggestion they were traumatised, how would you then accommodate that knowledge into this preference that you've described?
I think it would be a matter of speaking to the officers concerned and just to try and grasp the impact this incident has had on them. You know, it'll impact on different people in different ways and to a different level, if you like. So it would be, you would have to, but again, if you put 2 detectives in and interview a police officer, part of their expertise and their training would be to assess the state of the individual as to whether or not they're capable of giving a statement. So, you know, again, talking hypothetically, 2 detectives might go into a room to interview a police officer and come out and say, look, that officer's not in the right state of mind to obtain a statement from him. If that scenario presented itself, I would be looking for the officers to say to the officer, can you sit down and write down what you remember happened in as much detail as you possibly can, that type of thing. And then revisit that at a later point with that version of events and go over that with the officer to perhaps add more detail where it was necessary.
So that would have been another option to a simple interview?
Depending on the demeanour of the police officers at the time.
And on that basis, would you have envisaged that on a sort of one-to-one basis? So there may be some officers that were traumatised and unable to assist, and others who were able to assist.
I would, rather than one-to-one, I would say two detectives taking a statement, and if the officer wanted somebody else there to accompany them, it would be somebody who was not involved in the incident, for example, a Federation representative or somebody like that. That's in an ideal world.
And is that the type of arrangement that can be put in place reasonably, within a reasonably prompt time, or does it take time to get resources?
No, I
to
think
do
that would be fairly easy to put in place. Other than, you know, the Federation representative might be difficult because you might have to call them out, but you could be talking about a colleague who wasn't involved in the incident sitting with them, just to offer them that reassurance, if you like, that it's not 2-on-1.
And the benefits to an investigation, if that approach was taken, what would they be?
You're getting their version of events as soon after the event as possible, and they're not being influenced by any other persons who attended the scene and honestly and legitimately saw things differently, if you like, or had a different recollection of the events. So the witness isn't being influenced by anybody else if you can get them as soon as possible.
Right. And we've heard evidence about paperwork. You've already talked to us about statements and accounts. I'm interested in your perspective of the value of use of force forms or use of spray forms. Now, we've heard evidence that use of spray forms, CS spray is treated as a firearm in terms of legislation, and we've discussed with other witnesses about a memo that said those forms should be completed before going off duty. And then they are emailed to officer safety training and then passed to PIRC within a short time scale. So have you experience of officers completing use of spray forms?
Limited experience, but I've been aware of it having to be done, and it's part of the process because, as you say, it's treated as a weapon, if you like, but not overly so.
We've heard that officers didn't complete those forms that day and didn't complete use of force forms that day. Did you have any awareness or discussion or impression of the position regarding the forms and whether they were going to be completed?
If I'm being totally honest, it wouldn't have been something that was high on my list of priorities. It's a process that has to be done, but my observation would be there, if they've given a statement, then that would be sufficient information to complete that form, but it certainly wouldn't. I mean, as a senior investigating officer, my job is to establish what's happened. It's somebody else's role to make sure all the forms are filled out, if you like, not mine, if that makes sense.
In the absence of statements or accounts being provided by the officers, would your interest in the forms be elevated in that situation as SIO?
If it was a way of getting evidence of what happened, yes, absolutely, yeah.
Can I ask you about the situation? We've heard evidence that equipment and clothing was recovered from the police officers that day. Can you tell us about the type of approach you would normally take as SIO if you were recovering equipment from police officers who'd been involved in an incident?
Yeah, I have been involved in similar type situations whereby we've had to take officers' clothes and personal effects, and it's always my attitude has always been to explain to the officers that it's in your best interests to hand over the clothing you were wearing at the time and your officer safety equipment, for example.
And in terms of timescale, what would you be aiming for in relation to recovering that?
As soon as possible.
Why?
Again, to protect any potential forensic evidence on that clothing or on the pieces of equipment. So my action around then would be, do you have a change of clothing in the station? If not, get somebody to pick up a change of clothing for the individual and get that clothing seized as soon as reasonably practical.
And could you help the chair understand what that phrase means, as soon as reasonably practicable? Could you give us a sort of estimate of timescale?
It would be in these circumstances, it would be dependent on the availability of another set of clothing, if you like. A lot of officers come to work in civilian clothes and change into uniform when they get to station. If that was the case, I would want it done right away. If it wasn't the case, I would want somebody dispatched to the officer's home address or wherever to get a change of clothing for them, get back to allow us to seize the clothing they were wearing at the time of the incident. And that would be a priority.
Right. And we've heard some evidence a while ago now that in terms of threat levels, that officers were being encouraged to wear civilian clothing to work.
Yeah.
In May 2015, round about that sort of time. So in those situations, if officers had worn civilian clothing and had it in their lockers, is that something that could have been done reasonably quickly?
Almost immediately, yeah.
Right. So, and almost immediately, is that almost immediately after return to the police station?
But there again, you would have to have the officers available to seize the clothing and also seize it in a way that's protecting it for any further forensic examination later down the line. So I'm talking about bagging and sealing the clothing and labelling it and getting signatures on the labels. So it's a relatively straightforward and recognised process, but it wouldn't be a matter of there's my clothes there, thanks very much. It would be item per item, bagged separately and protected for any necessary further future examination. Forensic.
And that would be a scene of crime person rather than a forensic medical examiner?
A police officer. In an ideal world, I've seen a crime, but a police. So it would be a matter of one detective, the officer himself, putting the jumper in a bag, putting the trousers in a bag, sealing them, signing them off, and then that's then protected for any. So that there's not a lot of expertise needed for that type of recovery, if you like.
Were you involved in any way in any discussions regarding the seizure of a house occupied by a Martin Dick and his partner Kirsty MacLeod on the 3rd? No. Were you involved in any way in recovering a property that related to the family of Mr. Zaid Sahid?
No.
Was that part of any of your role or part of any officers that you were bringing from Edinburgh?
No, I have no recollection of that whatsoever. No, sorry.
We were going to turn to the Gold Group meetings. There was a couple of things I'd like to ask you about your recollection. I understand that they're available. Could we look at the Gold Group meeting minutes of 1440 hours, please? Thank you. And you'll see those on the screen. And this, you'll see the list of people who were present. And if we move down the screen, it was chaired by ACC Nicholson. And we'll see that, if you keep going down, please, we'll see Keith Hardie, MIT.
Yeah.
So it would appear that at this meeting at 1440, you were present. Do you remember this meeting?
I remember being at a meeting that ACC Nicholson chaired, yeah.
Right. Could we look at page 2 of these minutes? And I'm interested in what's effectively item 3 of the agenda, investigative process. So it was part of the agenda in the meeting which was discussed by DCS Bowl and Detective Superintendent Campbell. And we've heard from Pat Campbell that he was SIO. And I'm interested in the bullet point, which is at the bottom of this page. It says witness strategy. MIT to be deployed to note statements from significant witnesses. Update MIT to progress with investigation. Ongoing discussions, re-witness strategy to be discussed with PIRC. Discussion, re-seizure of production from police witnesses. Do you remember this part of the meeting?
vaguely, if at all, to be honest with you.
Seeing those minutes, do they prompt any memories?
My overwhelming memory of statements from officers and seizing the clothing was work in progress, if you like. It was being done.
Right.
And to be honest, if I made any further comment, I would be guessing. I really don't. I don't recall ever being given an action to go away and ensure with my team that the statements were to be taken from the officers, or indeed to seize their clothing. My understanding was that was being done. The officers were preparing their own operational statements and their clothing was being seized.
Well, just to show you the complete section 3 of the minutes,
Yeah.
there's just before section 4, it's on the next page, there's no task or action listed there in relation to that item about witness strategy or statements. So, and again at the end of the minutes, there's nothing there that would suggest there was a particular action allocated to you.
No.
Or MIT.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Can I ask you to go back, please, to page 2 of the minutes, again, remaining with item 3 of the agenda. And if we can move up the page, please. I'm interested in the section that's at the bottom of the page there. Seizure of productions from officers being carried out today.
Yeah.
Staff have been advised by Federation staff not to provide any statements. Do you remember that part of the meeting?
No, I don't. I genuinely don't. It's clearly by that. I was aware of Federation representatives being present at Kirkcaldy, or being told they were present at Kirkcaldy, but that I would have to say, I've no recollection of that. But if that was the case, then you couldn't action a request to get the officers interviewed because the Federation have already instructed them not to provide statements.
Mr. Graham, I interrupt again because the transcript has stopped. And I think what we'll do is just continue, and the stenographer can complete the transcript from the YouTube broadcast subsequently.
Thank you. Thank you. And then I'd like to move on to the NOK, next of kin strategy. You see the bullet point just towards the bottom of that page. It says there, partner of deceased made aware and statement noted. No formal ID has taken place, but ID has been done by a Facebook image initially. Next of kin identified as sister and a flow being identified. 2 Police Scotland flows have been identified. 1 DI is flow to brief and coordinate. I'm interested in 2 aspects of this bullet point. Do you have any recollection of a discussion about ID having been done by a Facebook image?
None whatsoever, no.
No.
I'm not sure how that could be done to serve any purpose, to be honest with you, but no, I've no... I mean, I don't... No formal ID has taken place, but ID has been done by a Facebook image. What does that mean? Somebody's looked at a Facebook image of Sheko and said that's him? I don't know.
That's my understanding, that a Facebook image or images have been obtained, and officers have gone to the hospital to carry out...
All right, to compare the Facebook image with
Yes.
the deceased.
Yes. Oh, can I ask you for your comments about that approach, using a Facebook image to carry out an ID, not a formal ID, obviously?
Never heard of it before. I don't see a huge issue with it because it's informal, but just to confirm, you know, it is who we think it is, if you like, I would be okay with it. I've never heard of it and would consider it a wee bit unusual, but it's nothing. Identification's vital, obviously, but I've never heard of it being done that way, to be honest.
Would you have any concerns about it being done that way?
My only concern would be that you're asking a police officer to say 100% either way whether an image of somebody is the person who's now deceased, which, you know, it might sound easy, but it isn't easy. It definitely isn't easy. I've been at postmortems before for unidentified males, and officers have come to view the male because they've had numerous dealings with that individual in the past, and they've been able to say with any certainty that it's the same person.
They've not been able to
Not been able to, absolutely.
And if that informal process was followed, how comfortable would you be about then sharing a death message on the back of that informal?
It would all be
idea?
down to the wording of the death message, I think. You know, we believe this individual may be your son or, you know, your husband, whatever, but we haven't formally identified him. So it would be that, you know, it's like if a person goes missing and a body's found, they'll tell the family immediately a body's been found, the body of a female, for example, but no, there would be no definitive, this is your daughter's son or whatever, until there was a formal identification through a number of ways, DNA, dental records or whatever, or formal viewing by the family of the deceased individual to confirm that identification, which is required before the post-mortem would take place.
Thank you. And then the other aspect I'm interested in relation to this bullet point are the comments about the next of kin strategy. What would your approach normally have been in relation to next of kin strategy? And particularly with regard to deployment of flows?
Yeah. First and foremost, the flows would never be responsible for passing on the death message to the next of kin. That would be done by somebody independently, and then the flows would be deployed thereafter. It's just considered best practice, and I think it's to do with the relationship with the family or the next of kin and the flows themselves, because their job is to build up a very good relationship with the family. And I think if they delivered the death message, it would be harder to build up that relationship. So it would always be somebody independent who would deliver the death message, and then the flows would be deployed from there.
And were you aware at that time of any discussions about difficulties deploying flows or getting flows in place, either in relation to Police Scotland flows or PIRC flows?
My recollection is that the PIRC had trained family liaison officers, but I wasn't aware of any significant difficulty in this occasion.
You mentioned death message. What, in your experience, would the sort of normal practice be for a death message? You talked about independent people delivering the actual death message. I'm interested in how a death message is drafted, whether there's a record of it, that type of thing. What's the normal procedure?
I suppose it would depend on the circumstances, but it would generally be two officers would attend at the home address and inform them in the simplest of terms, without using police jargon or terminology, if you like, whoever has died. But obviously in a situation like this or a homicide, the family liaison officers would be ready to step in as soon as the people who had passed the death message left the house, if you like. Yes. And the family liaison officers would be briefed by the SIO as to what they can tell the family or what they can't tell them, you know, because obviously it's important that all the information passed to the family is correct and accurate to build that relationship of trust between the flows and the family of the deceased.
So you've talked about the flows going in as soon as possible after the death message is relayed. Is that something that has to be coordinated in advance in terms of the timing?
Yeah. As an SIO, I would always go and meet the family of the victim as well. But that would be facilitated by the flow. Excuse me. And I would go and give them an update as to the progression of the investigation.
When would you do that?
It would depend on how upset the family were. But I would seek information from the flows. I would say to the flows, tell them I want to meet the next of kin or the family and find out when it's convenient and when they're ready to meet me, and I would take it from there as to when. But I would always, every time I've been deployed as a SIO, I would go and meet the family as soon as I possibly could and when they were ready for it, if you like.
And what have the benefits of that been in relation to family members of a deceased?
I think normally in an investigation like that, there's media coverage, and I would do the media. And there was quite often a request from the family to meet the officer in charge of the investigation. And I would go and go there and introduce myself, explain what I was doing, what I was trying to do, and basically leave them with the flows being the conduit to them contacting me if they wanted to speak to me about any particular, line of inquiry or what's happening with the investigation.
So when you've acted as SIO, have you been accessible to families to provide information?
Absolutely, yeah. I would tell them that at the first meeting, and I would get the flows to tell them that I will make myself available at any point, within reason, but at any point if you want an update, and I'll do my best to tell you everything I can, but you have to understand there's potentially specialist knowledge involved which I wouldn't be able to impart to you at this particular time.
And have you felt that benefited the investigation? Having that good relationship with the family?
That's the role of the flows. It's the flows' role to ensure we have a good relationship with the family. But yeah, absolutely, I think it does. I think, to take the time to go and meet the family, explain who you are, explain what you're doing, explain, what we're going to do to try and resolve this and bring the person responsible to justice. It builds on the relationship that you have to build up with the family, which is massive as the inquiry progresses.
And what impact does that have on building trust with the family?
A huge impact. I mean, that's why the flows are there. The flows are a conduit between the police and, the victim's family, if you like. It's not new as a concept. It goes back to the sort of Stephen Lawrence inquiry, and the importance of, in some investigations, the family are an absolute minefield of information which assists the investigation, if you like.
A mine of information?
Yeah, not a minefield, yeah. And you have to try and use that to your benefit as often as you possibly can. So your flow deployment is one of the main deployments, one of the most important deployments at the start of an investigation. And they're all trained to a level that, you have to be trained as a family liaison officer, and the training's quite intensive.
Right. And does that relationship that's built up have wider implications, not just in terms of the benefits of liaising with the family, but in terms of the community impact? What benefit is there in that?
I think the purpose of it is to show an openness and a bond between the investigation team and the victim's family, if you like. The impact on the community, I don't really know that it would necessarily have a big impact on the community, but obviously if the family are sharing their experiences of their grief and what the police have done to help them, then that's going to spread throughout the community.
you. Can I move on to the next Gold Group meeting minutes? These are at 20:15 hours on the same day. And the number I have is PSO 6493. But I think that's incorrect. Again, we see if we can look at those present at this meeting, it appears from the list that you again were present at this meeting. Do you remember having a meeting in the evening that day?
Vaguely.
And again, it appears Keith Hardie was there from PIRC and John Ferguson. Could I ask you to look at page 2 of these minutes? And it's item 3 on the agenda, and it's item 3 at the end. It says task. Keith Hardie met, collate another inquiry team out with P Division for transparency, independence, liaise with PIRC. Do you remember a discussion at the Gold Group meeting about transparency and independence?
I think it was an ongoing theme of the meetings. I do have a vague recollection of that for me to identify another inquiry team, but I do remember it being, I suppose, transparency and independence, a theme of both Gold Group meetings, if you like. As I said previously, this was groundbreaking for me and the majority of people in attendance there, that the PIRC were coming in to take over an investigation which was started by the police. So yeah, a vague recollection. I mean, for something like that, I'm just interested in the task. By that time, you know, I don't have any responsibility by way of a senior investigating officer. I'm accommodating the PIRC, and my job is to ensure their requests are met.
And in terms of the issue of transparency and independence, do you remember having an impression about why that was being discussed in connection with this?
Yeah, well, my recollection was, you know, at the end of the day, the police have arrested a black male and he has died after police contact. So it's massive, you know, it's significant. There's all sorts of concerns around about that, and rightly so.
And when you say concerns, can you explain to the chair what you mean by that?
I would say the most obvious one would be, is there a racial element to this, you know? And there would be concern. At the end of the day, the police were meant to be here to protect, you know, protect communities, protect individuals. Now, something's gone wrong during that apprehension of Shekel, which has led to his death. So the police are going to be scrutinised for it, and rightly so. So transparency is massive. We have to be seen to be transparent and not hide anything, or being as open and honest as we possibly can.
Being open and honest about the events at Hayfield Road, would that in some way damage the investigation that is being done?
I don't see how it could. Sometimes you have to withhold information for the protection of the inquiry because it's specialist knowledge, if you like. That might be considered as not being open and honest, but there's a good reason for that. Other than that, I think openness, honesty and transparency is what we should be all about, you know. And tragic circumstances which has led to the death of an individual, we have to be open, we have to be transparent, and we have to be honest. And you know, a lot of the things I've spoken about today, the recovery of the knife, I don't like being critical of the police because I was an officer for 31 years, but you have to be honest about it. These things could have been done better, in my opinion.
You're talking about a situation where maybe special knowledge you would withhold.
Yeah.
For the non-lawyers that are listening to your evidence, would you be able to give an example to explain what you mean?
It's difficult actually, but it's knowledge that belongs to one person, which can't really get in the public domain because it's no longer specialist, if you like. So if it's published in a newspaper or media, it's no longer specialist knowledge, and that specialist knowledge might be significant to the inquiry or the investigation.
And that specialist knowledge could ultimately be significant at a trial
Yeah,
against that particular one person.
yeah, absolutely.
And if they were the only person that knew
Mhm.
that special knowledge,
Yeah.
that could be a significant piece of evidence at
Yeah.
the trial.
Yeah.
Thank you. You've talked about concerns, you've talked about the significance of being open and honest and transparent. In relation to independence, can you explain why that is important in an investigation?
It's always important, but I think on this occasion it was to take away the investigative responsibility from the police to an independent agency, so that again, there could be no inference of collusion, of a police force investigating itself doesn't sit well with the public. An independent organisation coming in to investigate a police force or the actions of police officers sits far better with members of the public because you have that element of independence.
Did you have any concerns about the independence of the investigation that day? Obviously, you've talked about you not having any contact with Kirkcaldy Police Office or the officers. Did you have any concerns about the independence in relation to PIRC's role?
No, I never, no.
And the fact the majority, I think you said this morning, were former police officers. Did that cause you any concern?
I'm not sure that's actually accurate, but it was my perception of but no, I would say, I know it can be looked at in two different ways, but my interpretation of it is these guys know what they're doing, or these individuals know what they're doing because they've done it for a long period of time. They're experts in their field. That's how I would look at it.
And what about we've heard evidence that there was ongoing, initially, actions taken. We've heard Colin Robson was the 5th Division
Yeah.
SIO, and actions were prioritised, initiated, actions taken by 5 officers
Yeah.
on the 3rd of May. What would your comments be about that in relation to this issue of independence?
My only observation would be, was that before the fiscal had determined that it was going to be taken over by the PIRC? There is, in these type of inquiries, when there's a number of different people involved from a number of different areas and organisations, it's vitally important that everybody understands who is in ultimate charge, who is the SIO, and it's an issue I had throughout my career. We had to make, especially when you were being deployed to, like for example, I was deployed to Inverness on a homicide inquiry. There was a DCI in Inverness, and the officers involved in that inquiry were reporting to him, so that had to stop, and it had to be made known that here's the individual in charge of this investigation, to ensure not only independence, but to avoid confusion. There would be no point in somebody coming back and briefing the DCI at Inverness when I'm the officer in charge of the investigation. That was difficult at times because it was only natural for the officers there to go back to their manager, but we had to put a strategy in place whereby, no, you go to me because I've been appointed as the SAO. I'm appointed by the Deputy Chief Constable or whoever, but it's me that's in charge of this.
Is that how, in the example you give about the Inverness case that you were involved in, how did you go about sharing with all the officers, that you were the SIO and everything had to come through you?
A briefing with the officers. I had a briefing with them all and explained to them, I've been appointed here, I'm the SIO, and I also spoke to the divisional DCI and said, look, if anybody's coming to you with information in relation to this investigation, you have to direct them directly to me, because it's ultimately me that's in charge to avoid any confusion. And there was no point of him sitting with information that was vital to my investigation. It had to come through me. So getting everybody together and explaining, look, to avoid confusion here, I'm the SIO and you report to me.
What would you do if some officers are out tasked with priority actions already and only some are available at the police office when you arrive? How would you resolve that issue?
Before I had the briefing, I would make sure everybody's gathered together. I wouldn't necessarily take somebody away from priority actions, but I would put out a message: the minute you're finished that, come back to Kirkcaldy for, say, for example, a 6 o'clock briefing, where I would brief everybody involved in the investigation and make the lines of supervision and who's in charge of the inquiry perfectly clear. The best way of doing it with the DCI at Inverness was, I just said to him, it was after his tour of duty, you better not be in here. If he wasn't there and present in the office, nobody can go back to him with information. So that is quite often the simplest and best way to do it, if there is confusion.
Right. And so that's something that, could that be done, how quickly could that be done after you arrive and as SIO?
I would very quickly. So I can set out the terms of reference, set out what's important, what's not important, highlight your priority actions, highlight what you want done that day immediately and what's a lesser priority. When we became Police Scotland, it was about introducing different people from different forces prior to becoming Police Scotland, so we all could at least put a face to the name type thing. And obviously as SIO, I have a policy file that I have to fill out, and I would record all that in my policy file to ensure that it stands scrutiny later down the line should it go to court or whatever.
Tell us about your policy file as SIO. How would you fill that in?
It basically starts with a summary of what you are faced with, if you like. So you would basically write a brief summary of what you're dealing with, and then from there you would start documenting your policy decisions. That's not every decision, that's your policy decisions, like, for example, appointing a crime scene manager, and you would the way the form was set out, you would have to justify that action as to why you're doing that particular, or making that particular decision. And that forms a document that would be available at any court proceeding further down the line.
If you were doing a particular handover, for example, to another officer or to an organisation such as PIRC, is that the type of decision that would be noted in your policy file?
I suppose because of the timings around this investigation and the fact that I was never appointed the SIO, I would never have started a policy file. But I'm sure it's been policied somewhere by Mr Nicholson, Leslie Bowell or whoever, Procurator Fiscal's decision, PIRC to be called in to investigate the death of Sheikh Obayo. And the reason for that would be independence, transparency, etc., etc. And then it would be over to the PIRC for them to complete their policy files, or the SIO, if you like.
Right. And if a handover was to be done with an SIO and PIRC, is that the type of level of decision that would go into that file?
Yes, yeah.
And we've heard evidence about things called daybooks as well.
Yeah.
And we understand they're different from policy files.
Oh, yes, yeah.
And can you tell us, in your normal practice, is a daybook something that you've used?
All the time, yeah.
So could you explain the distinction and how you use the daybook as opposed to the policy file?
Sure. A daybook, as it's called, is an A4 hard-backed book of lined paper. And I would use that to, for example, at a briefing, I would note down this witness has said this witness has said that type thing. And at some point later, I would review what I've written down and decide what needs to go into my policy file. But the policy file was for sort of strategic decisions, not, Keith Hardie was a witness and saw this. To go and interview Keith Hardie wouldn't be a policy decision, but an action would be raised on the Homes system to go and interview that witness, if you like. So your policy is all about how you're directing, investigating the circumstances and why you're directing it a particular way. So you might have a policy file with only 10, 12 decisions in it because they're at a strategic level, but you would make over 100 decisions around how the inquiry's being developed.
In each of those areas?
Yeah.
We've heard about, as part of an investigation as SIO, that hypotheses may be considered, possible reasons why someone has died, and that these hypotheses will be then the subject of various tasks or priorities themselves. Would hypotheses be something that would be noted in the policy file or in the day book?
To be honest with you, and this is personal, I didn't like hypotheses. I never ever used it. I know it was a tool that could be used. I never used it because you can hypothesise as long as you want. At the end of the day, my job is to try and evidence and prove what's actually happened. You can sit and discuss all the potential, hypothetically, the scenarios that have brought you to that point. In my experience only, I know it's quite big in, investigative training. I've never really seen a huge benefit in it to, consider, could this have happened, could that have happened? The girl that was found in Nicola Bully that was found in the river, and the hypothesis was she was in the river. I don't see how that helps an investigation. You can hypothesise all you want. I want to stick to evidence and fact. That's my job, to provide evidence and fact to the Procurator Fiscal to allow them to consider a prosecution. So, very much personal, but I never really used it. I mean, you would also often think, in an unexplained death, could this have happened, could that have happened? But I wouldn't want to make that the focus of my investigation. I would want to look at securing evidence to prove that one thing happened, leading to where we are. So, a hypothesis for Sheikh Ubeo is not something I would have necessarily considered if I'd been appointed to SIO.
Right. And in terms of something you said a moment ago about briefing, if you were doing a briefing, you'd note down what a witness said. In terms of conducting a briefing as SIO, would you prepare notes in advance of that?
The initial briefing, yes. The initial briefing, when you bring the team together, I would have a summary of what we're dealing with to brief the team, or it could be off the top of my head, because it's fast running, if you like. So for that briefing, thereafter the briefing is more about the inquiry team's giving me the information so I can decide where that information is taking the investigation. So I wouldn't have notes for that. It would be more about me looking for the inquiry teams to brief me so I can decide based on what they tell me where I'm going to take the investigation.
And if the inquiry team brought you information which was of significance to your inquiry, is that something that you would note down?
Possibly, probably, but it would all go onto the Homes computer, and from that you have an action raiser, somebody who raises actions from that. So I might say, right, that's really significant. Can we get that logged onto the Homes computer and get the action raised from that as soon as possible? Then you would have a statement reader who would read that statement and say, right, I need to interview him, I need to raise an action to get him seen, and I need to raise an action to recover this or whatever. So the actions would be raised through the statement reader. But if it was vitally important, I would say, right, based on that information, I want you to go and do that, and that immediately, and you'll get your actions when you come back. So an action is something that's produced by the computer to go and take a statement, go and recover this, and then the officers who carry out the action fill out the action log and complete the action, and then it goes back into the home's computer.
So once something's put on the home's computer,
Yeah.
actions will be dictated through the system, the home system.
Not the system, through myself or the person who's inputting the information on what we would call a statement reader, if you like. So they would read the statement, and if one individual has named two other individuals, then obviously we would need statements from them. So they would mark up the statements in action, what's needing done based on that statement. If it was high priority, I wouldn't go through that process. I would say, right, I want him seen and her seen tonight, if you like, if possible.
Right. And prior to a matter being put onto homes,
Yeah.
or if it's high priority, you would deal with that yourself.
Yeah.
So,
Or, yeah, I
or
would deal with.
it would be dealt with immediately.
Yes, but it wouldn't, you know, my deputy or my crime scene manager might come to me, you know, and say, look, I think this is important. I'd say, yeah, go ahead, get that done, as a matter of urgency.
Yeah. You're the one dictating the direction or the strategy, and
Yeah.
I'm not suggesting you're going out and taking statements
No,
yourself.
not at all, no.
Can I ask you, we've heard some evidence about the taking of statements from civilian witnesses, and in particular, we heard evidence about Colette Bell, who was the partner of Mr.
Yeah.
Byle, being brought to Kirkcaldy Police Office. And she was breastfeeding a baby at the time. Her mother arrived at Kirkcaldy with her, with the baby to assist. And I'm interested in your perspective in relation to how a breastfeeding mother would be dealt with in terms of an investigation. So someone who is the partner of the deceased. And I'm interested in your views about, first of all, passing a death message to that person. Do you have any comments about that?
I think the overriding feeling would be sympathy towards the individual who's about to receive some tragic and life-changing information. Would be, you know, sometimes you pass the death message and then you have to leave that individual for days until they're ready to, you know, until they've started to manage their grief, got an understanding of what they're dealing with before you would be in a position to attempt to obtain any information from them which may be relevant to the investigation.
In terms of that time scale, how would you have any comments to make about a death message being passed and then within a short period going straight into an interview or to take a statement from that person?
It would depend on the demeanour of the witness, the person who's received that information. I would question it being done relatively quickly. I would question somebody who's breastfeeding going to a police station, but you know, there might be other circumstances that dictated that was a good idea, but you know, again, in my mind, breastfeeding, you know, that if it was a Colette
Bell.
Colette would go to another room to breastfeed the baby before coming back and continue. That's how I would perceive it. You know, I wouldn't be comfortable with two officers taking a statement of a mother who's breastfeeding a baby. Absolutely not.
I don't want you to give you the impression that that was happening in the interview.
Yeah.
I'm telling you that in terms of the context of her personal circumstances at the time. The evidence we heard was that Colette Bell had breastfed the baby and then gone to Kirkcaldy Police Office, and then at the police station in the interview room was told the death message. The baby was with her at the time and her mother was there at the time. We've heard she was very upset after the death message was relayed. I'm interested in your comments about the location, your views on, what are your views on interviewing a mother who has her baby with her in an interview room in a police station.
I don't like it. I would prevent it happening if it was me. I don't understand why. This is my opinion. I don't understand why she was taken to a police station to be given the death message, because my taking it would be you're better in the comfort of your own home with perhaps family round about you when that information is imparted to you as an individual. I mean, to take somebody to a strange environment, if you like, to pass on that message, I don't get it. I don't understand, you know, what the benefits of it would be. But there might have been circumstances that I don't know about it. But
We've heard evidence that Colette Bell called the police, had returned to her house looking for her partner. He wasn't there, and there were signs of a disturbance, if you like. And that was the reason that the property was being seized.
yeah,
In that situation, would you maybe see cause not to keep her in the house?
I would see cause not to keep her in the house, but I wouldn't see cause to take her to a police station. I would then be looking at alternatives like a mother, a sister, a relative. Let's take her there and pass the information on, and then withdraw to give them a chance to come to terms with the information before you would go back in with your family liaison officers to start building up that trust and start getting any information by way of witness testimony which may assist the investigation.
In a situation such as we have here, would that cause you concern, if you'd been SIO, would that cause you concern about any delay in taking a statement from Colette Bell?
I think it's about priorities and what takes precedence, and I think the well-being of the individual, you know, would take precedence over any delay and how that might impact on the investigation. So for me, it would be, we'll take a statement from her when she's ready and not before that point. And if that has a negative impact on the investigation, personally, I could justify that, you know, and that's, again, that would be something you would log in your policy file. Would be, you know, Colette Bell, potential witness, informed of the death of Sheku Bale, however, no statement taken on the time based on her traumatic state will be revisited tomorrow by Flows. So then, you know, if there is some criticism around the delay in taking her statement, should it go to court, I would be able to justify why that decision was made. I mean, you know, the grief of somebody who's just been told information like that, I would question whether it's even possible to start taking a statement from somebody like that. They have to get that time to, I'm not saying you ever come to terms with it, but at least to begin to come to terms with it.
I'm about to move on.
You are, that's a convenient point to stop. So we'll stop for lunch and sit at 2 o'clock.